Okay, we're going to pick things up from here. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Pastor Sean Boone. Boone serves Workbridge Church in Ferguson, Missouri. Sean has been a part of our Sage conferences from the beginning, spoke to us several months ago in our inaugural Sage conference, and we're delighted to have him here with us this morning. So, brother, please come, speak to us, encourage us. Thank you.
Thanks, my brother. Appreciate you. Hello, everyone, and everyone who's hanging out with us online. Again, he introduced me. My name is Boone. I pastor a church in Ferguson, Missouri called Woke Bridge Community Church. I am a church planting pastor there, which basically means that we go to an area to plant a church. We don't take the gospel to an area. The gospel is already there. We just go and try to make it accessible for people who aren't currently being engaged. And so that's part of what I do. Other part is I'm pastoring, so I'm teaching God's word, and I'm caring for God's people. I think what's probably the most unique and probably what's the joy of my ministry so far, I've been in ministry since 1999. Wow. I didn't think about it, man. I can't do the math, but since 1999, it's been the joy of my ministry. It's also right now what I'm doing is I am working in multi-ethnic ministry. And so part of my call is to pursue racial reconciliation in the faith-based space. So that's a lot. That's a mouthful. That's a handful. And that's a lot of different moving parts. I am married to Tequila Boone. We've been married for 21 years. This comes September. And we have a family of 5. We are a blended family. And so I have kids in several different, generations. My oldest was born in 1989. Then I had 2, I had one and my wife had one because we're a blended family in 1992. So it's a 32-year-old, 2 29-year-olds. And then since we've been married, we had 2 kids together, an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old. So I've been parenting for a very long time. And one of the things I've learned is that each season of my parenting has presented me with a completely different set of challenges. And my sinfulness has been exposed in all of those different scenarios. I'll be talking a little bit about what does it look like for us as we're talking about parenting through faith and doubt, through doubt and faith. And what does that look like for me, and what does that look like for us, especially if you are a person who is in relationship with black or brown people, or you may just so happen to be a person who is caring for kids that look like me. And so I want to just talk a little bit about that. And first, I want to say that, of course, I won't have all of the answers. I'm only going to be speaking for about 30 minutes, but all I want to do is help us begin to consider some things as we are caring for the people that God has in our lives, and also to encourage some parents along the way. And so I'm thinking about today this verse in 1 Peter chapter 5 when he says, casting all of our cares, all of our anxieties upon the Lord because he cares about us. And he's talking specifically about a place and a time where believers are experiencing a whole lot of external pressure. And I think right now it's true for us in this cultural moment to say that the church is experiencing right here in America a whole lot of external pressure. And that pressure shows up and looks different ways. And we know, we've heard it, we've talked about it, that people are in deconstruction, people are in deconversion, people are decolonizing their faith, all of those different things. But one thing is true for everybody, no matter where you are on the social, wherever your social location is. One thing is true is that as we are parenting our children in this season, it has become extremely difficult. Not only because we're trying to help them process their own doubt, and we're trying to make sure that we help them have a firm foundation on their own faith, but if I'm being honest, I'm processing my own doubt as well. Part of my call to be in racial reconciliation means for my family that certain options are off the table. So as we talk about you know, as people are in deconstruction, and a lot of my Anglo brothers and sisters who are struggling with the church and struggling with faith altogether, since their entire experience with the Lord have been in the white evangelical church, as they are deconstruction, they have no place to go. Which is different for people who look like me, is if we are in some of that, sometimes we can leave the white evangelical church, which we would probably call the American church, and we can go back to the historical black church. Well, that's an option that's not available for me and my family, because God has uniquely called me into the space of racial reconciliation, which means that I have to stick and I have to stay. And then that means I have to deal with a lot of the questions, the concerns, not only of my children, but also of the people that God has called me to pastor. And so first I want to talk about this. The reality of the issue is that many people, especially people that look like me, have this view of the church only through the lenses of the American church. And so, in other words, they see the church as this political entity that is in place, and part of what they do is they are there to prohibit and prevent us from having access to rights, freedoms, privileges, etc. And so that's a challenging thing that we have to deal with, we have to name, and we have to be able to process. So I'll be talking about three things today as we're talking about this thing. What does it look like for us? What does it look like for me? I'll be sharing a lot about my personal experience, my personal journey, and hopefully that'll be something that will be an encouragement for you, and also that will be helpful for you. First thing I'll be talking about these three things. First is we need humility. We got to figure out what is it going to look like for us to parent in this season with humility. Another thing I'm going to be talking about is we need also to be parenting with honesty. We need to be honest about where we are, and we need to be honest about the real hard and tough questions that our children are asking. And then the last thing I'll be talking about is we need to be really thinking about honestly parenting through and with vulnerability. And so first, I'm so glad that Zach and my sister said so much good stuff. So all I got to do is kind of parrot some of that stuff. But one of the things I have written down in my notes is that what we need to do is we need to create a culture where listening can happen. And so that's one of the hardest things that has been for me to learn, because I grew up in an era where, I don't know if this is true for anybody else in the room, where they would tell you get out the room when grown folk are talking. And so when they were talking about real life issues, we just didn't have access to that. And which meant that when we struggled with things like faith, when we struggled with things like sexuality, when we struggled with things like that, we really didn't have safe places to go get the information or the help we need. Now we're in a space in a period where that's not possible. For an example, I was talking to one of my daughters, my 18-year-old daughter, and she said to me about a church that we were in partnership with, in relationship with. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you a question about said church." And I said, "What?" She said, "Is said church the same church that has been talking really harshly and critical of people in the LGBTQ community?" And I said, "Baby, I don't think that's true." I said, "This is what I heard." She said, "Well, I listened to that same sermon, and this is where she landed." So me and her both landed. We listened to the same sermon, and we landed in completely different places. And the reason why that was so important for her, because as a woman, a young woman of color, she's 18 years old, she sees oppression of any people, no matter who they are or where they are, that only gives permission for her to continue to experience oppression as an African American woman. This same daughter went to a very good high school. We were so grateful and privileged to be in this Christian high school right here in St. Louis. But the problem in that school, which is a great school, great education, I mean, they really have shaped her in so many different ways, good ways. She's built lasting, meaningful relationships. She's participated in sports and in orchestra and all different types of things. But one of the things that was a problem for her was that in 4 years of high school, she only had one African American female teacher. And she felt like in that school that she was never really seen, she was never really heard, and she also felt like the overall culture of the school was of a place that really didn't care about her or the things that she cared about deeply. And so as we're preparing for college, this 18-year-old brilliant, strong, committed young African American woman tells me that I need to go to a historically black college or university because I can no longer be in a space like this. I can't do 4 more years in a space like this. And so, of course, as a father and as a parent, that was very heavy for me. As a matter of fact, if I'm being honest, that is something I'm still processing today. And so we're looking at schools. We still haven't decided, and time is really winding down. And so we're talking about parenting through doubt right now. That is something that I'm dealing with in some major ways right now today. And so eventually we go look at other schools, and we go to a school. We're on this campus. It's not an HBCU, and we're having lunch, and we're sitting at the table, and we're talking about our options. We're talking about finances. We're talking about resources and all that. And she looks me in my eyes. She said, "Dad, I know that it would be hard for me to go to an HBCU, especially the one I want to go to." But she said, "I'm just so tired of being the minority, and I want to go to a place where that is not it." What she was trying to say, what she didn't have language for, is that what my daughter is experiencing is culture fatigue. That's what she's dealing with, and that's what she's experiencing. How do I know that's real? It's because I deal with cultural fatigue too. And that's when I talk about we need to have this environment in our families, in our homes, in our relationships where we can really listen, because had I listened closely and attentively to what my daughter was saying, I would have completely missed it. And wanting what's best for her, I probably would have put her in an environment, in a place that would have caused her anxiety and unhealth. And so also we're talking about this thing where we have to be honest. And so what that means that I have to be honest with her about my own doubts. I have to be honest with her about my own mistakes. And I have to do more than that. I have to apologize for that. And I have to pursue repentance for that in the presence of my children. And so what that means for me is, we're talking about this cultural fatigue. I have to be honest and say, "Hey, baby, I feel it too. I'm dealing with it too. I'm an African American man. I'm in a white evangelical space, and I often feel like there's nothing that I'll ever be able to do. There's no degree I'll ever be able to get. There's no article or paper or journal entry I'll ever be able to write where I'll ever really truly be seen as an equal." And so until I can name that for her and be honest with that for her, it makes it very difficult for her. And so one of the things we have to do as parents, especially if you're parenting kids like mine, we have to be able to be honest about the real struggles. I have to be able to say to her, yes, the way the church has presented here in America disgusts me too. I have to be able to say, I don't trust them either. I have to be able to say, I don't believe they care about me. Are we okay in the room? Are we okay? Okay. I got to make sure because I'm trying to be loving, and then sometimes, I think I can be. Anyway, let me keep moving. And so when my daughter was having this conversation, back to this conversation about this church and the sermon that this pastor preached on human sexuality, preaching from Genesis chapter 1, me and my daughter ended up on completely different spaces. That meant I had to be honest about something else. I believe it's somewhere in 1 John, chapter 1, where it talks about we have to be willing to confess our sins, and it is a God that is just. He'll cleanse us up from all this unrighteousness, right? And so I had to confess to my daughter as we're having this conversation, because I just didn't get it. I really didn't get it. And so then I realized something about me. For the majority of my life as a believer, for the majority of my life as a pastor, I was insensitive toward people who are different from me in that way. I didn't care well for the people in the LGBTQ community in my family, in my church, in my community well. I have to be honest that the historical African American church did not do a good job administering to and caring for people who are different. And when I was able to name that, then I was able to understand exactly what she was saying and exactly what she was hearing in this sermon that caused her to have some concern. And so if we're going to be honest about who we are, what we believe, and what we feel like God has called us to, we have to be able to be honest. First, that means we have to be able to look inside, critique our own positions, our own postures, and be honest where we have missed the mark. So for a young African American girl who feels like the oppression of any person validates her oppression, I have to be able to enter into that space with a level of sensitivity and skill that I don't have always. And so that means that I have to also, when I'm being honest, I have to often say, babe, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I have to say, baby, I have limits emotionally. I have limits intellectually. I have limits physically. But what I'm willing to do is listen with you and let's learn together. So you can be praying for us because we have a date. We're creating a date. We're going to listen to the sermon together. And it's going to be some of what Zach said earlier. We'll listen, we'll look at the video, we'll listen, and we'll pause, and we'll have discussion. And so we're talking about people of color and what those doubts look like. We also have to realize that people who have been historically oppressed, or even if they or believe they have been historically oppressed, they have this tendency to gravitate to everybody who've been oppressed in any and every way. And so that means as an African American father and an African American pastor, I'm going to have to grow. I am going to have to learn more. I am going to have to listen more. I am going to have to learn what does it look like for me to love, to see, to respect, acknowledge the Imago Dei in everybody, regardless of where we agree and where we disagree. And that's going to be hard for me. That's going to be challenging for me. And I'm sure it's challenging for most people who have children, especially children that are old enough now to make their own decisions, to form their own opinions and choosing their own patterns and paths in life. The second thing I want to talk about is not only do we need to be honest about our limits, but we also need to be vulnerable. That means telling our personal stories, telling our family stories, and being honest about who we are. Because it's in those stories, we know that we will find not only some hope, but also there is a space there where real, authentic healing can take place. So I have another daughter who's 14 years old, who's about to enter into high school, and one day, a random day, she texts me while she was at school. She never texts her mom while she's at school, but she'll text me, and I'm like, you can't be texting me, right? Oh, I'm on lunch. I'm like, you still can't be texting me. But she texted me because she had this question. Matter of fact, it wasn't her question. It was a question of a friend of hers. Her friend knows that she's a believer. Her friend knows that her father's a pastor. And her friend, this is an 8th grade girl, believes or heard that because she identifies as a gay, that she's going to hell. And so my daughter says, hey, my friend wants to know, because she gay, is she going to hell? And I'm like, I can't do this on the text. Right? I mean, it's impossible for me to do this on a text. And so what I text back was, I'm not sure that's true, but we need to talk. And then I had to get vulnerable with her and say to her, hey, your friend is beautiful. She's wonderfully made. She's created in the image of God. But, being vulnerable, I don't know what to do with that. And I had to not only confess my sin to my daughter, but I had to be vulnerable with my daughter and tell my daughter that I don't know. But we can talk about it. We can pray about it. And so this particular daughter, who's only been at school, one daughter, kindergarten through 8th grade, went to school in our district, which is a predominantly African-American school. Then she went to high school, predominantly Anglo school. Now, this particular daughter is 14 years old, and she's still in our school district. And so she's in a predominantly African-American school. And so that means that though we're called to reconciliation, though I'm called to reconciliation as a pastor, and we're doing life in a multi-ethnic space, that means that for me it's easy because I've been in the space for a very long time. I've been doing this for about 15 years. But for my family, not so much, and it's extremely difficult. And so now I got to have this conversation, not only with this 18-year-old daughter who says that she's sharing with me that she is going through and experiencing this cultural fatigue, even though she didn't have the right language for that. I have a 14-year-old daughter who's coming with a whole different set of questions, and she is asking the question about the Anglos that are part of our church family, and everybody in my family wants to know this question. And I'm going to say it, and I don't mean anything political by it, but I'm just wanting to be honest. Remember, we're talking about we need to be honest, we need to be vulnerable. And so what everybody's asking is, what type of white people are they? Are they the Trump white people? And so when we talk about parenting through faith and doubt, we're dealing with all of these different, heavy, weighty issues, and we're trying to answer these questions, and we're asking, what do we do with that? How do we respond well to this? In a way that honors and dignifies and respects and acknowledges the image of God of our brothers and sisters that look differently and live differently, even if they are the Trump white folk. And so what does that look like for me to have this conversation with my 14-year-old daughter? So we're talking about this doubt. We talk about faith. We're asking this question about how are we going to parent through this well, while trying to, in one hand, deal with the doubt and faith of the children that we're parenting, and then in the other hand, we're dealing with that same doubt ourselves. And so if and when I'm vulnerable with my daughter, I have to tell my children honestly, with vulnerability, you know what? Some of the people that we're called to care for, serve, and love, they just will never see us as their equals. That's just the reality, because I pastor some really cool folks, some really solid Anglo folk who love me, who pray for me, who pray with me. We do life together. We share sacrament together. But I still also know that this is true. I can say something that's hard, that's challenging and different, something that they haven't heard before, and they have to, for their own peace of mind, they have to go and fact check me. And when I get fact checked, I'm always being fact checked with a white theologian. And so when I'm talking up to my children and I'm inviting them into this space, and I'm talking about doubts, and I'm talking about faith, I have to be vulnerable, and we have to be honest. What do we do with that as parents? When our kids are struggling with the same things that we are. How do we determine what is the appropriate amount of information that you can share with your children? Because they have access to so much stuff, we don't have the luxury of always waiting until we think they are mature enough to be able to handle the conversations. That's unfair. It ticks me off. I wish it wasn't so. But the reality is that is not an option for us. So we have to be willing to have the hard conversations earlier than we would like to. And we have to be willing to have them often. So what does it look like for me to be honest as a parent? What does it look like for me to have to try to help my children understand that the American church is not the church, it's a part of the church? How can I help them see that the global church is beautiful and it's diverse and it always has been, even though the expression we get here in America has been extremely limited and most of the things have been whitewashed? What does it look like for me to be honest with my kids, be vulnerable with my kids, and then tell them that we are called to go to create a church, to plant a church where all people are welcome. And we are intentionally not just going to have a diverse audience on Sundays, but we're going to have a diversity at our dinner table. And we're going to learn how to love, to forgive, to embrace, and to accept. Sometimes people who may never be able to see us as equals. Lastly, I want to say, because I know I'm running out of time here. The last thing I want to say, not only are we talking about honesty and vulnerability, I think this one is probably the one that is probably the most difficult for me. Is what does it look like for us to do this with humility? What does it look like for me to humble myself, to teach my children to take a posture of humility for the sake of Christ, for the sake of his kingdom, for the sake of his church, which means that we have to sometimes be willing to put our personal preferences and our personal issues of pride to the side in order to pursue what we believe God is calling us to, and creating an atmosphere and an environment where a celebration of diversity can take place and a pursuit of reconciliation and unity can take place. Proverbs reminds us that, pride comes before destruction. And sometimes I have to be able to tell my children that I'm struggling with pride. I'm tired of being the black guy on the team. I'm tired of going through this life where I don't feel like I'm at home or fully accepted, embraced in the historical African American church because of my choice of where I'm serving and doing ministry at. And likewise won't experience and don't feel like I'm at home and fully accepted, embraced in the right church. So how then do I help my children as I'm preparing them to leave us, to leave us, right? And I'm only talking about two of our kids because three of my children are already out the house. And only thing we can do now is pray for them. And so how do I, with humility and with honesty and with vulnerability, be honest and real about the facts of racism and segregation in the church in America and all of the many ways that we are not a part of the story. And so all is not lost because we know that there's hope, because we know how the story ends. We know, so we get to still, even though we can, with vulnerability and with honesty and with humility, talk about all of these hard issues, we have the privilege to approach everything from a posture of a people who work from the end of the story. We know how the story ends, and we know that it's going to end with all people, all tribes, all families, all tongues worshiping God together in a place where our diversity and our differences won't be eliminated, but we will be able to do this in true beauty, in harmony, and together. Then that helps us then ask the question of, because we know that's how the story is going to end, how then do I parent from that posture? How then do I create these environments for listening? How do I create a space for transparency and for humility and for vulnerability and for all of those things? I'm sorry if I was supposed to give you an answer to that because I don't have one. That was kind of like a question. I thought someone was going to, help me answer it. But we don't know. And that's what it means to be honest about our limitations. But we still are called to love. I'm out of time. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for an opportunity to share a little bit with my brothers and sisters about some of the unique challenges of dealing with doubt and faith through the lenses of color, and how even though that is oftentimes reduced just to merely the color of our skin, but because we are sometimes that minority group, sometimes we are a part of, not always, but sometimes, Lord, we are a part of an oppressed group, at least historically in this country. That means that many times we are linking arms with and we're finding commonality with people that we may disagree with on so many other issues. Lord, help us figure this out. Help us learn what does it look like to lead well, to love well, and to be a people that point others to the true hope that's found only in you. Bless the rest of this conference and all of the speakers here. In the name of your